Thank you very much. I think my job has been made much easier by what Mr. Amitabh Kant shared, because the question that we had before us was what's next? And Mr. Kant has told us pretty clearly what is going to be next. So perhaps there are a couple points that he mentioned, which perhaps as a design community we ought to look at rather carefully. The whole issue of urbanization, which Mr. Kant indicated is going to be the thrust of where our society is going, if that is indeed what the design community's real challenge is going to be in this incredible shift of humanity from rural areas into urban areas, then maybe one of the things that we need to think about today and tomorrow is what capacity and what experience do we have to make that transition more humane and more decent. Anyone who has any idea of working in urban slums, as I have had to do through my son's work for children who have special needs in the slums of Ahmedabad, know what living hells we have created over the last several decades. And if urbanization is going to mean more of these living hells, then I think the design community has its work cut out for it. Because at this moment, we really don't know what that transition should mean in design terms. We have had some examples, some encouraging examples, but we've had huge and colossal failures. And Bombay perhaps is an example of a city which has managed to handle these things comparatively better than many other urban centers. But you who live in Mumbai, who are Mumbaikars, will understand that Bombay has not found any solutions that seem to be sustainable. And the word sustainability came through in several things that Mr. Kant has just shared with us. But two words that he used I think are critically important: inclusivity and social justice. We actually don't know how to do that at present. And if that is our design challenge, I think there's a huge amount of homework that design institutions will have to do. It's not as if we didn't anticipate this. When the time when design education came into India, these visions of what the future would be were certainly in the minds of the nation builders who had the foresight to include design into national development. But over the past 70 years, we haven't been too good at delivering either inclusivity or social justice. And here, I think the design community does have a responsibility. For example, in my city of Ahmedabad, the great pride today is the Riverside Development Project, which some of you may have heard of. Okay? So now you can zip from one part of Ahmedabad to the airport along these quite magnificent roads and gardens along the riverside. And that is considered to be the symbol of our progress towards a better urban environment. But for all my years at NID, the students of our institute would go to the riverfront to learn from the communities who live there, who have now been displaced in the largest urban displacement in the history of independent India. And we do not know where those creative people have gone, except into another urban hell in another part of Ahmedabad, where they've been put into so-called high-rises. And the situation is that this city has lost a huge creative community whose displacement was never part of urban planning. So I think we have to look at this and say that do designers of the future have a better way of planning? I think the real challenge will be, and here Mr. Kant and his colleagues have been working in some of the schemes that you just heard about, to take the services and the advantages that urban dwellers are supposed to have into the rural areas, so that there is some kind of break on what is today an extremely tragic process of migration. And you just have to go to our cities to see what is happening and to be able to say that if we want a better future, then how are we going to make sure that migration takes place without tearing down the fabric of the societies which are being displaced? So one of the things that I would suggest that be included when we look at this whole question of urbanization is how do we take urban services into the hinterland? Because villages are becoming towns and towns are becoming cities. So the old rural-urban divide no longer really applies. And so what is it that we actually mean by urbanization? And how are we going to do that in some kind of an interesting and humane way? The other point that I think is extremely interesting that Mr. Kant has just made, when he talks about Indian innovation for the rest of the world, and he talked about 1,300 multinationals who have relocated their R&D to India. Now that's something I think which the design community should really look at and ask ourselves, if that is happening, then how much of Indian design talent from our design schools and those who have graduated from our design schools is actually involved in this R&D? What I was hearing over dinner and breakfast today is that the situation is not entirely without its issues. So how much of that pie is actually going to Indian design talent? Do we know? Because this is an extremely important statistic that Mr. Kant has shared with us, 1,300 multinationals having transferred their R&D to India. So what are we doing? And are we satisfied with the role? Because today, one of my most distinguished colleagues, who's had much more experience in this than I, said to me over breakfast that our designers are becoming courier boys for global companies working in India. And if that is true, then we are in real trouble. And therefore, the statistic is not enough. We have to go into that statistic and say, were we not creating the right design talent? Is there something lacking in our young people that these multinationals perhaps have to convert them into courier boys and girls? Or is there some other imbalance that needs to be corrected? I don't know, because I'm not involved on a daily basis like many of you are in this huge transformation. But here's an incredible opportunity. And have we understood that opportunity correctly, and do we know what to do about it? I'll go back to just one thing that Mr. Kant tossed away while he was speaking, but it's extremely important. He talked about frugal engineering. And to my mind, that term frugality is a very critical one for our future. Because, as he has pointed out, the future is not the American model. And yet that is the model that we are chasing hell for leather. And we have not yet had the creativity, the innovation, or perhaps the guts to actually put forward another Indian model. Mr. Kant has challenged us to say that if the models of North America, Europe, and China are not the models of the future, then what is? And I think that if there is a subtext to what he has spoken about, that's our opportunity. So, in the what next, can we indicate that there is an Indian alternative or alternatives, and can we demonstrate what those alternatives are? And use that for what Mr. Sharad had said early this morning on nation building. And just one other phrase that Mr. Kant has used, which has been very much a part of my life for the last at least 7 or 8 years, he used the term sunset industry and sunrise industries. Now, I spend a large chunk of my life working with artisans of this country. And they represent what, up to the President of India, claims to be the second largest source of Indian livelihood. But about 10 years ago, we were told at the highest levels of decision making in New Delhi that the craft sector, which is India's craft sector, is the largest in the world, was a sunset industry, and that we should forget about it and let it remain with the museums and with festivals, but they had nothing to do with the future of India as a global power. This was a shock to us, because we grew up, my generation grew up, in a culture and an environment where it was impossible to conceive of an Indian identity without the handmade industries, or to conceive of an India that became free without crafts being at the center of a freedom struggle, which was a first in human history. And yet, here we were being told there was a sunset industry. A few years later, the World Crafts Council held its convention in China. And the worthy who came down from Beijing to open the conference spoke in Chinese, and we had interpretation. He said that 10 years before this conference took place, that means in 2004, China had identified 2 industries as critical to its future as a global power. And he said 2 sunrise industries. One, he said, was IT, and the second was craft. And he spoke about how in China's craft sector had been destroyed during the Cultural Revolution, and now the country was struggling to get it back. Why? Not just out of a sentimental involvement with Chinese ancient past and cultural legacy, but because creativity and innovation, which are the subject of our discussions here, because creativity and innovation are the source of survival in an increasingly competitive society, and these values and these capacities come from the craft sector. If you lose the craft sector, you lose much more than your handmade industries. And that reminded us of a slogan which had emerged from the European Union just 2 years before this conference. And that slogan was, "The future is handmade." Now, this didn't mean that Europe was packing up its factories. It did mean that Europe was trying to bring back its traditions of craftsmanship, which would be so essential to its future in a competitive market. And here were we in India with the world's largest resource of craft creativity, dismissing it as a sunset industry. We rushed to the translation booth to find out if we'd actually heard it correctly. Did the gentleman actually say sunrise? And he did. So I think there's quite a lot of thinking that we need to do about what kind of a future we want. A famous poet once said that the future is a land you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. It belongs to your children. But we are trying to imagine a future, and we're trying to get there, find a way to get there. So let's see what we can do, and let's try and see what we can do to make the best of this opportunity, but with our eyes wide open. Thank you.